Hello and welcome to the Magical Learning Podcast. As you can see from the description, we have a guest today. And before we get into you introducing yourself, Matt, as we always start, how's your week been?
Well, my week is just beginning. So we're talking on a Monday morning on the
Yes.
back of what has become, I think, a typical week for me. I've spent, the best part of 5, 6 years as a full-time human in the world of Four Pillars Gin. And on the 1st of July, so probably 3 months ago now, I sort of stepped back and I continue to consult Four Pillars, but I'm doing a bunch of coaching for other business leaders, CEOs, founders. And I'm also doing a lot of speaking. So last week I did the sort of range of stuff that I now found myself doing, but probably the thing that I was proud of last week was I attended South by Southwest, and the event I went to was
Ah,
Demo Day. And Demo Day is where every 6 months, the 10 or 11 businesses that have been through the StartMate Accelerator get to stand on a stage and show the progress they've made in 12 weeks. And I'm very proud to be a mentor at StartMate. So it's been really fun sort of being able to take that learned experience from a decade of helping to grow my own startup to then being able to mentor some other people and hopefully add a bit of value. So that was my week last week.
oh, what a fun week. I could talk all about that just for the podcast. So, Matt, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience? I will hold up your book, Lessons from Gin.
I wish I
Um,
had a copy as well. Imagine one
That's
here.
okay. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey, and then we'll go into Four Pillars Gin.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, my name is Matt Jones, and I began my life as an economist, not a very good one. I didn't know what to do with my economics degree, so I joined the UK civil service. I grew up in the UK, and so my first job was in London. I actually found my first job to be in military intelligence. I didn't really know that until
Mm.
I went to the job interview, and I spent 2 years as a pretty bad economist in sort of kicking around in the government economic services part of the UK civil service. And the one thing I think I was quite good at was sort of sitting in these rooms that were full of technical experts and just incredible minds, and often just being quite good at seeing and articulating the big picture and what was really going on. Um, I did a bunch of stuff. I went back and studied a master's. I met an Australian girl, which is why I ended up living in Australia. But the critical thing is I shifted from being a civil servant to working in politics. And I moved into political campaigning. I became a speechwriter, a political campaign strategist. And I think without realizing it, I was learning about brand. I was learning
Mm.
about this idea that while in theory we would love to think that the most important decisions we make are rational, and one of the most important decisions we make is who should govern our country, who should take care of our economy and our education system and our health system and law and order. But the truth is we make those decisions based on some combination of instinct, emotion,
Mm.
tribal loyalty, the families we were born into. And without realizing it, I was learning about brands and that side, the irrational, emotional side of businesses. So then I made another move. I moved from the UK to Australia and from politics into the world of brand. I joined a brand experience agency in 2006, just on the cusp of the world of smartphones. The iPhone launched in 2007, the world of social media. Facebook had been around since '04, but I suspect most of us didn't get our first Facebook social media accounts until the early 2010s. And so I sort of got this great education in the world of brand building and brand experience at a time when the world was changing profoundly. And I formed pretty strong views about how brands got built and the ways that brands and brand owners needed to make decisions to sort of make the most of the modern landscape, this landscape where consumers had more information, had more control, where social media meant that small things could scale. We no longer, the traditional ways that big businesses had power in the marketplace were getting massively disrupted. I had the great opportunity to go and move to New York and help to take over a creative agency there. Had a baby, came back to Australia, set up my own little consultancy. And one of my very first clients was a guy called Stu Gregor. We became mates. He quickly introduced me to his other great mate, Cameron McKenzie. They'd been playing with the idea of making gin. The three of us said, should we turn the idea into a decision and make that first decision and put some money in the bank? And away we go. And that was 2012. A year later, or 18 months later, we were launching Four Pillars Gin in December of 2013. A decade after that, we were named the world's leading gin producer for the third time. And that really brings us reasonably well up to now.
Beautiful. I love that. So tell us, about why you wrote this book. I love how you've set this book up where you tell stories and share sort of insights, but you've also got things around strategy, branding, etc., as well as some awesome recipes for those who like gin. So tell us a little bit about your book and just how you came up with that format too.
I do want to touch on the second part of your question in a moment because it's interesting as a creative person who has written a lot and done a lot of strategy, and you think of yourself when you're a strategist as someone who creates structure and clarity, and then you take on the challenge of writing a book and going, wow, this is a whole different level of
Mm.
structure and clarity that we need. So that was a really interesting part of the journey that I'll touch on, but I'll take the first question first. I've been really fortunate over the past sort of 6, 7 years to be invited to stand on sort of keynote stages at big conferences and events a lot and talk about typically the intersection of two things. What is it that I have learned about building a brand? And the other is what is this experience of Four Pillars been like? Because it has been this great experience. And there's just been so many incredible stories that have come out of that journey of Four Pillars. And the thing I have enjoyed standing on those stages is that feeling that you can entertain people and engage people with case studies and with storytelling, but you can also leave them with value. You can also leave them with valuable tools and ways of thinking that they can go and apply to whatever they do. And I've stood on some really interestingly divergent stages where you go, what the hell does that guy from the gin business, what right does he have to stand on that stage? And yet I've had people come up to me at the end and go, I work in education, I work in the health system, and I'm going to take away and think about XYZ. So I've really found that very
Yes.
satisfying. And so when it sort of came to writing the book, I thought, well, how could I sort of try and capture that, both the lessons learned, but also this duality of serving them up as stories, but then trying to abstract the thinking from those stories. So I sort of divided the book into, first of all, four big themes about what does it take to build anything, whether it is your career, whether it's your small business, whether it's a charitable organization. And for me, the first and maybe obvious, maybe this is, my 14-year-old daughter would just reply with a duh in saying this, but the first is thinking. And I think we're often a culture that we almost have this obsession with doing, that action is what counts, and sort of LinkedIn teaches us that we should just show off about how action orientated we are because weak people think and strong people do. And it's like, well, actually, thinking is really critical, getting clarity. Because the thing for me about the thinking is a decision like making gin is not a big idea. Like you're just doing something that hundreds, thousands of people have done before. And most businesses, to be honest, are the same. It is just a decision. And so you need real clarity. Why is this the good decision? Why is this the right decision? Why do you have the right to succeed in making this decision? And when that decision opens the door to dozens and hundreds of other decisions you need to make, what is the clarity? What is the thought process that will help you do that? So thinking is really critical. I think one of the things that thinking unlocks is clarity around your purpose and what I call your craft. And I think a lot of people will look at that and go, well, obviously you had a craft. It's making gin. That's a craft. But I'm like, well, all of us have crafts. You, Danette, have a craft. Your
Yes.
business has a craft. Every professional, every leader, whether they're in financial services or insurance or banking or technology business, we have things that we do better than other people. We have strengths that we could invest in, things, muscles that we could try and build every day that can truly differentiate us. And I think that is your craft. And if you can identify that and then really work on that, you've started to get the bones of a great business, which leads to the third big theme, which is sharing. Just because you have a great craft doesn't mean you automatically get the credit it deserves. So how are you going to share that story? How are you going to scale and amplify that? And by the way, how much do you need to amplify it? Like how big do you need your business to be? How many people do you need to reach? And then the fourth and final area is the challenge of growth, the growing pains, because we do all these things to grow. And then as we grow, the game changes. And to quote
Mhm.
Marshall Goldsmith's book, what got you here won't get you there, or at least not all of what got you here will get you there. And there's a bunch of stuff that didn't get you here, but maybe now you need to do to get you there. And so how you then figure out what do I carry with me and what do I leave behind? Where do I hold true, and where do I need to let go? I think is the fourth and final piece. So I sort of tried to go through those, and I end up, to answer your second question, using a Miro board, which is effectively a giant
Mm.
digital whiteboard, to really try and mind map this out and go, I love talking about this stuff for 45 minutes on a stage, but now I've got 70,000 words and a whole book to populate. How do I then really explore these themes and populate each of those four sections with a series of what I call useful bits, where we extract the tools, the sort of strategic processes, and try and show them in action in a way that could be applied to everyone. So it was a fascinating process, sort of designing and conceptualizing. And there's so many different ways you can tell a story, chronologically, thematically, but ultimately trying to do it in service of the reader, and thinking of the reader almost as a user, and going, of course I want to entertain you, of course I want to share some great drinks recipes, but I also want you to have some pages where you keep the corner of that page turned down and you go back to it again and again because you found it so damn useful.
And as a business owner, 26 years, there was so much great stuff in there. And I do have folded pages. So you achieved your aim, if that was your aim. It was awesome. So one of the things I loved was your four pillars way, but I really liked the made from gin part, where you went from we make gin, we make gins, to then we make things from the gins as well, and working with community and stuff like that. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that with our listeners and viewers too. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah. No, thank you. And there's probably three things I'd love to reflect on there. I think the first thing is, right zoomed back, is making a decision about what business you are really in.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, it was very clear that we were in the business of making gin. Now, there's a lot of people who start up gin businesses, but they decide they're in the business of distilling. And the first thing they distill is gin, because gin is delicious and gin is relatively simple to make. It's not relatively simple to make great gin, but it's relatively simple to make a decent gin. Gin is distilled juniper. If there's no juniper, it's just weird vodka. But once you've got a canvas of distilled juniper, you can then sort of add whatever you want, and you can do it in more traditional ways. And you've got yourself a London dry gin that sort of smells like a pine forest on a good day, Pinot clean on a bad day. But you can also add all sorts of wonderful contemporary botanicals. And in Australia, we thought we just have so much opportunity to bring something amazing to the world of gin, whether it's the incredible fresh citrus we use in our red dry gin, whether it's soaking gin with Shiraz grapes to make our bloody Shiraz. So we decide very early on, we're going to be in the business of making gin. And that immediately put the blinkers on our business. It said, no vodka, no whiskey, no rum. We're not going to play with anything else. We are just going to be pure gin makers. And I guess so we don't get bored, but also so we live our purpose. That means we're not going to make one good gin and then stop and become a marketing business. We're going to explore gin. We're going to make many gins, plural. I look back, I'm exhausted sometimes just thinking about the speed with which we were developing and launching and telling the stories of new gins. And that, in turn, when you like dig deeper within the business, you go, well, then, so the business we were really, really in was the business of mastering everything that went into the production of gin, the production techniques, finding the best stills that we could in the world, the botanicals, the role of fresh produce, understanding what happens under different styles of distillation to flavor. And it was that focus on mastery of process that led Cameron to go, well, I don't like throwing flavor away. I don't like the fact that we steam all these oranges to make our rare dry gin. I, I take them home, I make orange cakes, but that's just cluttering the kitchen and that's not sustainable or scalable. What else can I do? And luckily, because we were based in the Yarra Valley, we had this incredible sort of neighborhood collective of friends who were doing everything from making beer to making cheese to making wine. And we had a really great mate who was a preserve maker. And we said to her, could you try these out and see if they make a good marmalade? And it turned out they made an award-winning marmalade. And we started adding a dash of Campari and calling it a breakfast Negroni. And from there, it was only a couple of years later that we were making a salt as well, using dehydrated gin botanicals. We were making a chocolate, always with expert partners in their area. But I think the critical thing, and the other side of answering your question, was right from the start, we didn't say, I know we said we're only going to make gin, but now we make gin and breakfast preserves. Now we make gin and marmalade. We said, well, we still only make gin, but we make things from gin. So we took responsibility for framing the story around why we make marmalade. We called it our Made from Gin program. We didn't know where it was going to go. We didn't know that it would include feeding spent botanicals to local pigs and calling them gin pigs. We didn't know that it would include rescuing the stillage, the water left in the stills, and washing the rind of a cheese with it. We didn't know that it would involve using the heads and tails of distillation to make hand sanitizer a few years later when the world would need it. But right from the start, we named that program. And I think that's one of the things that I try and call out to leaders of all types, particularly leaders who aren't communications or marketing or brand people, but are business leaders, and say it is so important to frame and communicate the value of the decisions you make, to take responsibility for the stories you tell, because the stories you tell will shape the stories other people tell about you, and they really, really matter. So I'm always very proud, not just of the craft and the community, as your question sort of alluded to, have made from Jim, but also the act of sense making and storytelling that we put around it.
And you're a master at that. It just came through beautifully. So I'm really curious how much, because in the book you talked a bit about experimentation and just the way you wrote it and the camaraderie between you and the other two. How much does experimentation and having fun, how has that shaped Four Pillars, Jim?
Oh, I think it has shaped Four Pillars immeasurably. And I think it shaped me as well. I was,
Nice.
without question, the least fun of the three
Oh, ouch.
co-founders of Four Pillars. I mean, I met Stu and Cam, and they were and remain great mates. And their main mission in life is to have great fun
Yeah.
together and with each other. And yet at the same time, they're not unserious people. Cameron
Yes.
Cameron is a guy who was so determined and so committed. He ran fast enough to make the Australian Olympic team in '96. He ran in the 4x400 squad and made the semi-finals in Atlanta. Stu went from being in the wine industry and super passionate about wine to going, actually, the contribution I can make is building Australia's best wine and drinks and food focused PR agency, because we make great wine in Australia, but we don't tell the stories so well. So you've got this incredibly pragmatic, determined guy. You've got this guy who's got this unbelievable entrepreneurial instinct and a great communicator and a great connector. But also, neither of them take themselves too seriously. They both believe that you need to have fun in business and that fun will come through. And I learned a huge amount from that. And I think Four Pillars struck that balance really well, because on the one hand, we did have fun with gin. We did trust our instincts. We didn't spend all of our time doing market research, asking people what they'd like, because, as Henry Ford said, they'd have said a faster horse. As Steve Jobs would have said, no one ever wanted an iPod where they could put all their CDs and navigate with a click wheel. You had to use this judgment as to where people would
Yes.
want, what they would want, and where they would want to go next. However, I think you only earn the right to do that if you're really bloody good at what you do. And I take no credit for this, but what Cameron became really the best in the world at was exploring the flavor possibilities of gin. And Stu's got an incredible palate as well. So I was so lucky that these two people looking to have great fun with gin, they also had the mastery and the expertise and the judgment to be able to then trust those instincts. And I think that is the magical combination. I think if you can, I think this innovation, experimentation, call it what you want, it can come from you intrinsically. You don't always have to ask the world what it needs. You can also think about what is special about you, but that does start with there being a specialness. And I was really lucky to partner with two people who brought absolute specialness to that development of liquid.
Love that answer. All right. So I'm curious for you personally, what was the most interesting growth opportunity that you experienced, particularly your model of having three co-founders is interesting as well. So I'd love to know, what was your most interesting growth opportunity?
Oh, how many am I allowed?
Oh, as
I'll,
many
I'll
as you
try,
like.
but I'll try and discipline myself. Look, I think there are a couple of dimensions to this. I think the first is that in 2006, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, I moved to Australia and joined a creative agency. I'd never worked in agencies. I'd sort of been a political speechwriter, an advisor, and of course, in doing that, you are giving other people advice. You're sitting next to a minister, or in my case, a shadow minister, because I only worked in opposition because I completely failed in politics. I never worked in government. But you're advising them on what to say and what policies to adopt, and how to frame language in a speech. And then you move into agency world, and you're professionally giving advice. You are responding to briefs, you're giving advice. And I was very lucky. I working both in Australia and then the US for businesses like Samsung and Google and Audi. I got to work with some phenomenal big brands, and it's incredibly exciting, that feeling that you have a seat at the table and you could advise others. But there is something different to when you're the person who paid for the table, when you're the person who has now got to take the advice, and it's your money where your mouth is. So I think the first thing was that shift from being a person who advises on some things, because typically you're advising on the things where you have been given a brief, and now you've got to think about everything. So, the first thing for me was learning about the interconnectedness of a business. And instead of seeing things in silos and going, okay, I've got a brand challenge or a marketing opportunity, going, well, actually, no, I'm the co-CEO of the business. So I may have a particular lens and a particular perspective and a particular opinion, but I have to see this thing in the round. I think the second thing that I really took, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book, is that you realize how cheap ideas are and how important and valuable execution is. And you don't get paid for a good idea. You get paid because a good idea translated into great delivery, great execution, great outcomes. And it sort of teaches you to value a different part of that sort of process, and particularly for Four Pillars, where the big ideas were always in the flavor, always in the gin. The big ideas were always Cameron's. It was let's combine gin and Shiraz grapes. Let's use olive oil to make the world's best martini gin. Let's go and make gins with other distillers around the world and not see them as competitors, but see them as collaborators. Let's turn gin steamed oranges into marmalade, or whatever it may be. Yeah. My job was just then help put those ideas on a pedestal, tell great stories, take beautiful photographs, build great social media community, encourage people. We talked about this notion of intimacy, to encourage them to come ever closer. My job was often to think about how are those values in the business embodied in our aesthetics, in our touch points. I talk a lot about the importance of signals as well as stories, that it's very hard to make someone watch us make gin for 8 hours and go, okay, now I get it. Now I understand how they make gin differently and better. So you then have to send all these signals to people in terms of attention to detail and design, from the quality of the bottle to the paper stocks to the aesthetics of the spaces that we built, both in our distillery in Healesville and our home in Surrey Hills. So that notion of prioritizing execution and quality of delivery, I think, was really critical. And then the last piece, which you alluded to in your question, was really thinking about the importance of placing, I don't really care what you call it, marketing thinking, brand thinking. Rich Karlgaard calls it soft edge thinking, emotional thinking, thinking about feelings, placing some more of that at the leadership table. And I think that's what we were really lucky with in our sort of co-CEO trio, is we really valued that. It was never someone outside having to remind us to say, well, don't forget about the fact that brands don't exist. It's just Four Pillars. But what really matters is how people feel about Four Pillars. Perception is reality. You need to shape those perceptions. Instead, we understood that. So we understood that the gin was everything. And we understood that how people felt about the gin and perceived the gin and talked about the gin was also everything. And so that duality was absolutely sort of landed in the way that we thought as a trio. And that for me is probably the most profound thing that I will take now into the rest of my career.
Love that. So curious, there will be some listeners and viewers who are interested in starting their own businesses, and you've shared those insights. Is there any other key lessons that would be valuable for people thinking of setting up a new business?
I'll try and sort of limit myself. In the book, I share a bit of a checklist, and one of the things I try and do in that checklist is just urge you to think really clearly about those very first decisions you are making about the business or the industry you're going into. Do you know enough about it? Do you have an angle? This is a world of abundance where we don't need another anything, but we always can benefit from a different something, a better something, or a something built for someone. Have you thought that through? Have you got clarity on that? I think the second piece that I try and share is helping people interrogate what I call the butterfly. And the butterfly is just a fancy name for a Venn diagram of thinking about what does the world need and what's special about you, and making sure that you are building an idea or a product or a proposition that sits right at the heart of that. The third thing I'd mention here, because there is so much in the book on this topic, is having a clear theory of growth and theory of success. And I think this is a piece that is so often missing from early stage plans that I see, which is understanding what is it that's going to get us to that first viable point of scale. So let's say you and I are going to start a soft drink business. The question is not who's going to buy the first 100 bottles, because we will figure that out from friends and family and favors. The question is probably not who's going to buy the first 1,000 or even 10,000 bottles, because there's always curious, engaged people who want to try new things. The question is going to be the 100,000 bottle scale, the million bottle scale. What is it going to take to get there? How much money will we be making when we get there? How much money will we have had to spend to get us there? At what point do we start to be sustaining, self-sustaining, break even? At what point do we start to be viable? What's it going to take to do that? Do we have the theory? Do we have the clarity? Do we have the money in the bank or the investors behind us? It's quite boring and daunting stuff to think about, because it's the grown-up stuff. It's the stuff that asks you to step back from the excitement of the decision. I am going to open a gym. I am going to set up my own business. I am going to make this, and step back from that excitement and go into that pragmatic space. But included in that pragmatism, as we just talked about, is the feeling side, because I'm going to have to create something of value, and I'm going to have to make people want it. And I'm going to have to make sure people have heard of it and share it. So it's being really pragmatic, but also with that very difficult emotional side of the business. So those are some of the things that I would urge anyone starting something to really lean into, and give yourself enough time for that, because once it's on, it's on. And I see this every time I mentor a cohort at StartMate. They have 12 weeks. And if I don't manage to have a really good conversation with the founder in the first 2 weeks, they then are spending the middle 8 weeks just relentlessly trying to build and scale. And it's a microcosm of the same for any of us growing a business. We have this opportunity. We were very lucky at Four Pillars. The first money that went into the bank was ours. The three of us put some cash in the bank, and we spent it on sending Stu and Cam to the US. And the two of them went on a fact-finding mission. They were going to be the liquid leads, the champions of what we would make. And so they went and they traveled all the way from Seattle down to Los Angeles, visited about 30 different distilleries. They came back super excited. They're like, this is definitely a good idea. I mean, there's a surprise. You go on a 30-day road trip in a BMW convertible, have a great time. And guess what? It's a good idea. But it was a good idea. They also came back and went, we've got to make gin in a modern Australian style. The Americans aren't making British gin. Why would we? But the third thing, and the serendipitous thing, is they came back and said, we have to have this particular type of still, a still made by Christian Karl, these still makers in Stuttgart in Germany. And it was a blessing and a curse. The curse was this was going to be very expensive. It was going to cost us well north of $300,000. These days, it would be over $1 million. This was going to be the first Karl still in Australia. So that then forced us to take the funding side of it seriously. This was not a tech startup where we could just sort of bootstrap it. We were going to need proper money, and that couldn't all be ours. The blessing was it was about a 12-month waiting list from ordering the still to the still. We named her Wilma after Cameron's late mum, to Wilma arriving and being ready to distill. And so we had to pause. We had to take a breath and take some time. I think a lot of businesses, because you can start tomorrow, the feeling is you should start tomorrow. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier in the podcast, this almost like cult of busyness, this cult of action. And we have to take a bit of pride to go, you know what? I quote one of my mentors, a guy called Colin Pitt, a brilliant thinker about leadership. I could still hear it in his voice. He'd be talking about slowing down to speed up. There is no more important time when you need to slow down to speed up than when you're in those pre-launch stages. You haven't started yet. You don't have to change course. You haven't set the course. You have this opportunity to think. And so some of the things I've mentioned here are just some of the things I talk about in the book that I would urge you to think about. But what it's going to add up to is real clarity on not just what is my idea, but what decision am I making? What business am I getting myself into? What is it going to take to make this business successful? What is my theory of how I'm going to grow this business, both rationally and emotionally? And what is it going to take to pay for that and put enough fuel in the tank to get me to that destination? I think if you can think those things through and have clarity, that clarity is going to really put you in a great position over the next 12, 24 months, because the decisions are then going to come at you relentlessly and at speed. And it's enormously fatiguing. And the more you've got that clarity, that sense of theory, you can stay the course, you can make decisions fast, but also you avoid that horrible feeling of second guessing yourself, that sense that every day you're questioning what you're doing. Instead, you're going, no, I decided for the next 3 years, this is what is going to guide us. And you can just go back to purpose, go back to strategy, make the right decisions, and just commit to them and execute with confidence.
What a great answer. That's awesome answer, Matt. So, Matt, I'm curious now, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners and our viewers?
Yeah, but there is one thing, and and you asked me earlier, one of the things that I have learnt, and there is a danger of confirmation bias. I've always been fascinated. I studied economics at university, and it turns out the only useful bit is the bit they didn't teach me, which is behavioral economics. Economics sort of teaches you what happens in economies where everyone is rational, and then behavioral economics says, but actually they're not. Big surprise. We're all completely irrational. And we are all victims of all sorts of biases or heuristics, as behavioral scientists call them. And one of them is this sort of danger of confirmation bias. We seek and see the things in the world that confirm our biases and confirm our worldview. So I say what I'm about to say with the caveat that there may be confirmation bias at play. But I think I was really reinforced in my belief in the power of storytelling. And I think it played out in 4 pillars on two levels. The first was customer facing storytelling. We launched 4 pillars through crowdfunding, not because launching a crowdfunding campaign and selling that first batch of 400 bottles was going to make a particularly material difference to our bottom line, but because we felt it could build early momentum in our direct consumer model. One of the I've talked at length on this podcast about the importance of thinking your business system through, thinking your theories of success through. For 4 pillars, one of those thought processes for us led us to the realization that we had to do, to quote the film, everything, everywhere, all at once. We had to be strong in cool bars, and we had to be able to scale into retail, both independent but also national retail like Dan Murphy's and Vintage Cellars. Mm-hmm. And we had to build a really strong direct consumer business where we could sell gin direct to people who really cared and really wanted to get under the skin of the stories. And that would then lead us to opening physical homes and not spending millions of dollars on marketing, but spending millions of dollars on real estate to own the homes where we would make and host. And so in order then to run a successful crowdfunding campaign, you have to tell a compelling story because you are selling people something that does not yet exist. And so we saw right from the start the power of storytelling to make people want and appreciate and value something more. And Simon Sinek talks a lot about the notion of start with why. And I think he's right. But I think in many ways, what he's really saying is start with story. Have a story about why. Have a story that engages people. And I think the bit that then, if that was the unsurprising bit for someone who'd worked in politics and worked in brand, I think what I found then surprising was how important storytelling was internally as well. That we often live in a world where everyone wants to get a strategy on a page and create these very complex things. And I talk about it a bit in the book, that there are all these different models of sort of OGSM models. And anyone who's sort of come across someone who's been in sort of a McKinsey-esque world, there's all these different sort of strategy canvases and templates. And ultimately, we all tend to forget all of those things. And what sticks and what we remember is story. And so when we need to quickly think, what is the right 4 pillars thing to do here? So as we were scaling our business beyond three co-founders, and they're three incredibly talented professional in their own right partners, those three co-founders, those three partners, and those first employees. So beyond that first sort of core of 10, when you can still make decisions based on daily, hourly conversations, but you're starting to scale. You're starting to ask other people to think, what would 4 pillars do? How would 4 pillars respond to this message on Instagram? How would 4 pillars respond to this inquiry about a partnership? How would 4 pillars deal with this issue with a customer? And it couldn't always come back to the founders. The best way to convey that sense of instinct was through stories. And it's a source of immense pride to me that actually last week 4 pillars summer campaign, you realize in Australia, in the way our liquor industry works, summer starts very early. Like if you're gonna win in gin, you got to win in summer, and to win in summer, you got to start winning in October. And so our summer campaign went live, and this is the first summer campaign, the first big brand campaign to be launched since the co-founders of 4 pillars were no longer full-time in the business. I still very proudly advise the business, but I'm no longer full-time. And it was just incredible to see how the campaign was everything I'd have done and more and better. It was as perfect an encapsulation of everything the brand is about, but also the challenges the brand has, because now we've got to find the next wave of people who haven't yet tried 4 pillars. We've been named the world's best gin 3 times, and there's still many people who are buying at the price level of 4 pillars, but they've never tried 4 pillars because perhaps they think that Australian gin is a bit cottagey or not for them. And actually, well, we make the world's best gin, and our original gin that turns 11 in December, Rare Dry Gin, still makes the world's best gin and tonic with a big wedge of orange. So the campaign is single-mindedly focused on that. So it's a real recruitment campaign, but it's beautifully executed. So I can't tell you how proud I am to see a team that we recruited and we built do that without us. And then the little bit of credit I take, the little bit of credit that we co-founders take, is that we consistently told such good stories internally that from the people on the front line of our business in Healesville, who always tell our stories now better than us, to the team who are back in the sort of marketing and sales areas, building campaigns and building initiatives, I feel those stories have infected their thinking like a virus, and they're adding their own chapters to them. But fundamentally, we've aligned people not through clever strategy words, but just through contagious storytelling. So if there's a big thing that I've learned for leaders, it's never underestimate and undervalue the importance of storytelling externally. I saw this a couple of years ago when we achieved carbon neutral accreditation, and that was very proud internally, but also we made sure that every customer in the 4 pillars universe walked a bit taller and felt that gin tasted even better because we were treading more lightly on the earth. But equally, don't underestimate the importance of storytelling internally as a leader, as a leadership group, to communicate your strategies. And I'll say one more thing on this, which is I got to give a keynote last week to a very big marketing group, one of Australia's biggest corporates, and I was talking to their whole marketing community, and I sort of issued a rallying cry at the end. I'm like, we have to reject every time we are given a slide limit. Every time someone says, now remember, in tomorrow's executive presentation, you can only have 4 slides. I said, we have to reject it, because we have to be the people who start and say, before we get into today's proposal, before we talk about this initiative, let us tell you the story of why we exist and what we are trying to do. Because if we build a rhythm and a ritual, and we did this in prehistory times, we did this before we could even write things down. Indigenous communities were doing this for tens of thousands of years. We kept ideas and traditions and values alive by repeatedly telling them as stories. Businesses are no different. We are building our own communities, our own tribes, our own following as leaders. We need to be better storytellers of our own strategies and our own ideas. And if there's one thing that's just been triple underlined and highlighted multiple times for me in the experience of 4 pillars, it's that I entered with that belief in external storytelling, and I've sort of come out the other side still believing that, but seeing the importance of storytelling internally from a leadership point of view as well.
And that's such a great insight. I love that, Matt. So, Matt, I am sure that there will be listeners and viewers who would love to reach out to you and make contact. So where would be the best places for them to do that?
Well, often propping up a bar at 4 pillars, either at the 4 pillars laboratory in Surrey Hills,
Love it.
our little drink center, or of course in Four Pillars Distillery, the home of Four Pillars in Healesville in the Yarra Valley. But if we're talking digitally, I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn. I've got one of the world's most generic names, Matt Jones. But if you add gin to your search bar, you can normally find me. But I also
Perfect.
run a little brand coaching business I called Think Story Experience, and it probably comes as no surprise listening to this podcast that it's really just named after the three things that I think are really important: that clarity of thought, that focus on storytelling, and then delivering those stories in experiences that you execute beautifully. So at thinkstoryexperience.com, you can track me down, you can send me a message, you can find out more about the book. And I'm always keen to hear from people who want to learn more about the ways that I think and the ways that we can work together to help them think. So thanks for letting me give a little plug.
Oh, you're welcome, Matt. And for those who are watching the video, there is the book out now and a fabulous read. So, Matt Jones, thank you so much for joining us on today's Magical Learning podcast. And to all our listeners and viewers, have a magical week.